Welcome back, class 12, to the online bio classes. We had already started the second chapter, reproduction in plants. And you remember in the previous class, we had done the last topic was differences between self and cross-pollination. Self-pollination, once again, it is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the same flower, which is called autogamy. Or it can be another flower which is born or produced in the same plant, that is called geitonogamy. So two types of self-pollination is there, autogamy and geitonogamy. The other one is called cross-pollination, in which there is transfer of pollen grains from the anther of one flower of one plant to the stigma of another flower which is produced in another plant. Two different plants are involved in cross-pollination. Now today the topic which we have to do is agents and types of pollination. What are the pollinating agents? Recall, what are the agents? Agents means those substances which help in the transfer of pollen grains are called pollinating agents. Like wind is a pollinating agent, water is a pollinating agent, means the pollens are transferred by wind, by water, by animals also. Certain animals like insects, they help in the transfer of pollen grains. Similarly, the animals like snails, elephants, bat, all these help in the pollination of flowers. Different animals, even the birds are also used. Okay, so birds also we can write as the animals which help in pollination. So pollination can be done by all these different agents. They are called pollinating agents. Okay. Now next is anemophily. What is the meaning of anemophily? I will write the name of the agent here, like wind. Pollination by wind, the agent, pollinating agent, wind. Such type of pollination, or the type of pollination which is done by wind, it is called anemo, A-N-E-M-O, anemophily, P-H-I-L-Y. Similarly, if pollination is done by water, it is called hydrophily. Hydro means, the prefix hydro means water, and phily, P-H-I-L-Y, is there at the end of the sentence. So wherever you get this word, phily means that is type of pollination. So anemophily means wind pollination, water pollination is called hydrophily, as it occurs in Vallisneria plants. Then third one is pollination by bats. It is known as chiropterophily, C-H-I-R-O-P-T-E-R-O-P-H-I-L-Y, chiropterophily. Then fourth one is pollination by insects, like honeybee and other insects visit the flower in search of nectar to get their food, and during this process, when they visit different flowers, they transfer the pollen grains and bring about pollination. So this type of pollination which is done by the insects is called entomophily. What is it called? Entomophily. Then next one is pollination which is done by birds. Certain birds like the hummingbirds and the smaller birds, they can help in the transfer of pollen grains. Such type of pollination which is brought by birds is called ornitho, means birds, ornithophily. If it is done by elephants, it is like in case of Rafflesia flower, the largest flower, pollination is done by elephants. It is called elephophily. If it is done by snails and slugs, it is called malacophily, M-A-L-A-C-O, malaco, P-H-I-L-Y. So these are the different terms which are used. Now one by one I will discuss some of the characteristics of each of them, like wind pollinated flower or anemophilous flower. Since the flowers are to be pollinated by wind, it means they need to be transferred by the wind. The wind has to carry the pollen grains from one place to the other. So that's why the pollens are light in weight. The pollens have certain structural features which can help them to be carried away by the wind, and they are produced in large quantity. In both wind and water pollinated flowers, the pollens are produced in large quantity because most of the pollens are wasted while they are being carried from one place to the other, they may fall in some such places where the flowers are not present. So that causes wastage of pollen grains. That's why wind and water pollinated flowers produce large quantity of pollen grains. And the wind pollinated flowers have such type of anthers which can easily burst or open that can release the pollens into the atmosphere. They have a very sticky stigma which can receive the pollen grains at the time of pollination. In case of water pollinated flowers like Vallisneria, pollens are produced in large quantity, and the pollens have an outermost protective covering which is made up of waxy covering, you can say, to protect the pollens from water, otherwise it will get decomposed in water. So in order to protect it from decomposition, it has a waxy or protective covering around it. And this is also produced in large quantity in water pollinated or hydrophilous flowers. The pollens are produced in large quantity because most of the pollens are being carried by the current of the water or by the moving water from one place to the other. They may not get deposited on the stigma of the flower. So this flower produces, the water pollinated flowers produces large quantity of pollen grains. Then comes the bats. Bats also help in the transfer of pollen grains, and you know that bats are active at night. They are nocturnal animals, so they visit the flowers at night. Why they visit the flowers? In search of food. They get the food, that is nectar, from the flowers, and during that time when they visit different flowers, they carry the pollen grains on their body which is sticking to their body and get transferred to the other flowers when they visit it. Okay. The next one is insect pollinated flowers or entomophilous flowers. The flowers which are pollinated by insects, they are generally very brightly colored, means they have plenty of different types of colors. They have scent also to attract the insects towards them, and they produce large quantity of nectar or the sweet fluid which serves as a food for the insect, because insects visit the flower just to get their food, not to see the color of the flower. Although they are attracted by the color or the scent, but their main purpose is they visit the flower to get the food, that is the nectar. And while they are visiting one flower, then to the next flower, the same insect will visit different types of flowers. So the sticky pollens will stick to their body or to their wings or to their legs, and when they visit the other flower of the same species and rub their wings or fan their wings and rub their legs, the pollens get deposited on the stigma of the flower, bringing about pollination. Then next one is birds. Pollination which is done by birds is called ornithophy. So flowers which are pollinated by birds, they produce the sweet nectar as a food for the flowers so that the birds can be attracted, and the flowers also have bigger size because the bird's beaks can enter inside it and get the nectar from there. Then the elephants. Pollination by elephants is done only in the largest flower, that is Rafflesia, which is very big in size. So elephants are quite suitable for this flower to bring about pollination. Then comes snails and slugs. This type of pollination which is done by snails and slugs is called malacophily. And this malacophily pollination is done in flowers which are adapted for it. I will give you the example of that one also. Malacophily flowers. Okay. Pollination by bats. Yeah, Malacophily. Like chrysanthemum. One example, aquatic plant is there. Sometimes the larger animals like the lemurs, the free-dwelling animals like the rodents, reptiles like gecko, garden lizard, they can also bring about pollination. Why? Because they also visit different types of plants. And if they are visiting the plants, they may visit the flowers also and bring about pollination. Now we will study the next topic, that is advantages and disadvantages of cross-pollination. So let's do that. You know what is the benefit of self and cross-pollination? Both you have to study. So what you do is, in your copy you can write the advantages and disadvantages of both the self-pollination as well as cross-pollination. So now we'll discuss the advantages of cross-pollination and then the disadvantages also. First, the advantages of cross-pollination. Advantages of cross-pollination. What is the benefit of cross-pollination? Okay. First benefit is, in cross-pollination, two different plants are involved. So it will help to transfer the gametes, that is the male pollens, from one flower of one plant to the female flower, that is stigma of another flower of another plant. It means it will help to bring about recombination of genes. So you can write, it helps in recombination of characters or genes. Helps in recombination of genes or characters, I will write here, to get the desired variety. To get the desired, means whatever characters we desire to get, we can bring about by the process of cross-pollination. Okay, the plants which are produced by cross-pollination, they are healthy plants. Why? Because such plants have recombination of genes in them, which helps to bring the character of two different plants together in the hybrid or the individual which is produced by it. So it has characters of both the parents. So it is well adapted to survive or to adapt in the changing environment. So it has a high chances of survive in environment is far better than the flowers which are pollinated by self-pollination, because it has recombination of genes, and the plants are healthy also, and it is quite useful for the horticulture, like the person who is engaged in raising different types of flowering plants and crops, particularly the fruits and flowers for decorative purpose. So they can bring about different desired colors of flowers and all by doing the cross-pollination. Okay, so good for horticulture also, good for the gardeners also, to produce new varieties of fruits, new varieties of flowers. Now next is, what are the disadvantages? Okay, it can also produce disease-free plants. Disease-free plants can be grown, because if you know that this particular plant is sick, it has some disease, do not select the pollens from that plant. If you know that this particular plant is sick, do not select the stigma of that particular flower or that plant only, you neglect it because it is sick. So you can always select the healthy plants without any disease to bring about cross-pollination. So disease-free plants can be grown by this method of cross-pollination. Okay, now what are the disadvantages? This all we talked about the uses or the advantages. There may be some disadvantages also. Now what are the disadvantages of cross-pollination? Number one, the first disadvantage. You know that to bring about cross-pollination, someone is needed to transfer the pollen grain, that is the pollinating agent. So it depends on chance. So chance is there. Means if you don't want to write chance, you can write pollinating agent is required. I will write simply the agent. Agent is needed because the flower itself cannot transfer the pollen grains. It has to depend on some pollinating agent like wind, water or insects to transfer their pollens from one flower to the other. And in case if this agent is not available, it means pollination will not be brought about. So it will be a failure. Then the second one is cross-pollination always needs some like large number of pollens are to be wasted, like when wind and water pollinated flowers are pollinated. When pollination is done in wind and water pollinated flowers, large amount of pollens are wasted. So wastage of pollen also we can write. The second point, wastage of pollens. Example also you can give why the pollens are wasted, because in wind and water pollinated flowers plenty or large quantity of pollens are produced, but only few of them reach on the desired stigma of the flower, and many of them they get lost on the way during the transit when they are traveling from one anther to the stigma of a flower. Then it involves a lot of energy is required. So third disadvantage is, you can write, energy is wasted because the plants has to produce plenty of energy. Why this energy is lost or required? To bring about formation of new colors in the flower, to produce the scent in the flower, to attract the insect, or to energy needed so that the plants can produce nectar in the flower. So energy expenditure is also there, okay? And sometimes the undesirable characters are also introduced. So fourth point you can write, undesirable characters are also introduced by cross-pollination. This is disadvantage. How? Because the wind will not come to know that the pollens from which it has, like the pollen which it is carrying, is sick from the sick plant or healthy plant. The water will not come to identify whether the pollens are sick or healthy while they are carrying those pollens from the anther of a sick plant to a healthy plant. So in this way, during cross-pollination, one of the disadvantages is it can also transfer the defective or the sick pollens from one place to the other. Undesirable characters can be also introduced. Now, next topic which we have to do is fertilization. Okay. Okay. The next topic which we have to do is fertilization. What is fertilization? You know the definition. Fertilization is the process of fusion of male gamete with the female gamete. Okay. So process of fusion of male gamete. Here the male gamete is the pollens with the female gamete. Here the female gamete is the eggs. Female gamete is called fertilization. I am not writing that. It's called fertilization. Now, who discovered it? It was discovered by Strasburger. It was discovered by Strasburger. Name of the scientist? Strasburger. Okay, now, what is artificial hybridization? Hybridization, you know, the process of producing a new plant by crossing the male flower or the gametes of one plant with the gametes of another plant. So artificial hybridization is done by man. Hybridization means in which simply we cross two different plants. Like a plant with very big size fruit, mango fruit, is crossed with a plant with a small size fruit but sweet in taste. But if man is helping in the transfer of pollen grains and bringing about that pollination and hybridization, it is called artificial hybridization. There are two techniques involved in this process: emasculation and bagging. I must remind you what is emasculation. In class 10 also it was there in genetics chapter. Emasculation is the removal of mature anther. Why we remove the anther of a flower? Because we do not want the pollens to be produced from that anther. We want that we will select the pollens from a particular flower which we need according to our need. We select the pollens from a particular flower and deposit on the stigma of that flower. So that process of removal of anther is called emasculation. And bagging is the technique in which we simply cover the flower so that unwanted pollens, means the pollens which we do not need, should be transferred to the stigma of the flower. Whatever pollens we need or we desire, that we can put it on the stigma. Okay, so this process is used by man, that's why it is called artificial hybridization. Now, what is pollen pistil interaction? It is there in your syllabus also. Pollen pistil interaction. Pollen pistil interaction means pollen you know, pistil also you know. Pollen is the male part of the flower which is produced in the anther. Pistil is the female part of the flower which is also known as carpel, and it is made up of three parts: stigma, style and ovary. And interaction means what is the reaction taking place between both of them. So all those events, here just now we studied fertilization. So if suppose this is the male gamete and this is the female gamete, if both of them fuse together, now they form the zygote. Okay. Now this zygote, what is all the events that are taking place after fertilization? Like once the male pollen fuses with the female egg, this is egg, this is pollen, it forms the zygote. Whatever changes are taking place after fertilization is called pollen-pistil interaction. In a book also given all the events from pollen deposition, when the pollen is deposited on the stigma, then style is there and here ovary is there. After the deposition of pollens on the stigma, so all those events which occurs after deposition of pollen up to fertilization, deposition of pollen until the pollen tube enters the ovules, till the pollen tube which are germinated or formed from this pollen, they will go and they will enter inside the ovule. Ovule is present here. So this process is called pollen-pistil interaction. Got it? So what is pollen-pistil interaction? Once again the definition is, it is all the events means whatever changes are taking place, from the deposition of pollens till the formation of pollen tube and its entry inside the ovule. This entire changes is called pollen-pistil interaction. So you know that once a pollen is deposited on the surface of stigma, suppose this is the pollen deposited. Now this pollen, you know, has two cells. I will draw it here. A generative cell and a vegetative cell. Okay? You already studied in the structure of pollen grain. Now sometimes in this two-celled stage only, the pollen tube is formed and it causes or it enters the ovule and brings about fertilization. But in majority of the flowers, what happens that the generative cell, one of them will give rise to the pollen tube. And which one is that? The germination of pollen grains and growth of pollen tube. How it happens? It is when the pollen is shed at two-celled condition. One is called generative cell, the other is called vegetative cell. The generative cell is the one, like if I write this one is generative cell, this generative cell is the one which will divide to form two male gametes. That is, the two male gametes, sex cells are formed, and the vegetative cell is the one which will lead to the formation of, like this one is two-cell stage. Now a pollen tube is formed. From where it is formed? It is produced from vegetative cell. Vegetative cell. I have to just rub it to make it clear, okay? So, what is the diagram of? This is the diagram of a pollen grain. It has two cells. One is called generative cell. The other one is called vegetative cell. The generative cell is the one which divides to form two male gametes, okay? Generative cell divides and form two male gametes. So, I can draw two male gametes here. Alright? Then the vegetative cell is the one which helps in the formation of pollen tube. This pollen tube is formed. Pollen tube from where? It is produced from vegetative cell. And what is formed from the generative cell? Two male gametes are formed from the generative cell. Now this pollen tube, I will draw another diagram here so that it will be clear. Okay, now look here. This one is a pollen tube which is formed. Now this pollen tube will enter inside this is the ovule. So it will come and enter through the micropylar end. From here it is open now. This is ovule. Inside the ovule we have the embryo sac which contains the 8 embryo sac is present, okay? And this one is the pollen grain. So it carries the male gametes here. Two male gametes are there. And here in the embryo sac there are egg cell, two synergids is there, diploid central nucleus is there, and here the antipodal cells are present. I will make it more bigger so that you can see. So this is called pollen tube. This is the ovule inside which the embryo sac is present. You should practice drawing this diagram. And this one is the pollen male gametes. These two are the male gametes. Now one of the male gametes will fuse with the egg cell which is located in the center. If you cannot see the diagram, I will make it bigger here. This is the embryo sac. Here is the egg cell. And in the lateral side, these two are called the synergids. So these two are called synergids. Mergids. And this one is called the female gamete or the egg cell or ovum. So one of the male gamete fuses with the egg cell to form zygote. The other male gamete, two male gametes are there, fuses with this secondary nucleus to form, it is called secondary nucleus, to form the endosperm. So this type of fertilization is called double fertilization. Why? Because twice the fertilization occurs. One of the male gamete fuses with the egg cell to form the zygote. The other male gamete fuses with the diploid secondary nucleus which is present in the center of embryo sac. That is called double fertilization. And why it is called triple fusion? It is called triple fusion because this secondary nucleus is diploid. Diploid means having two sets of chromosomes, 2n plus the male gamete is haploid, 2n plus n, that is 3n. So that's why it is called triple fusion. Okay? Understood the term? What is and who discovered this? The term double fertilization was discovered by Naraski. So you should remember that name of this scientist also. Okay? Now next, I will say something, you just listen to it carefully. It's also there in the syllabus. Pollen pistil interaction. Compatible and incompatible. It's very simple. Compatible means matching. You know that when the wind carries the pollens, the wind cannot identify which is the stigma of that particular flower. It will just carry the pollens and deposit it everywhere. Maybe in the flowers on the road, everywhere. And flowers of different species also. So wind and water cannot identify that, and it will carry the pollens to the stigma of that particular species of the flower only. It may deposit anywhere. So if the pollen will reach on the stigma of the same species, which is compatible or matching, then only the pollen will germinate to form the pollen tube and it will bring about fertilization. But that is called compatible. If matching, compatible. But if the pollen falls on the stigma of another flower, like China rose pollen will fall on the stigma of some mango flower, it is not matching, incompatible. So that germination of pollen tube will not occur and the pollen will be wasted only. Understood? So that is the meaning of compatible and incompatible. Now next is entry of pollen tube into the ovule. You know that this is pollen tube. Now how this pollen tube enters inside the ovule? What are the different parts? Accordingly the name is there. Three names are there. One is porogamy. If the pollen tube, poro means if pollen tube enters the ovule, this is ovule, through the micropyle, you know that micropyle is the end which is open, this anterior part, this is called micropyle. Okay? This is the embryo sac. This is micropylar end, this end is called, the posterior end is called chalaza end. So if the pollen tube enters an ovule through the micropyle, this type of entry of pollen tube into the ovule is called, what is the term given? Porogamy. Remember the word? P-O-R-O. Poro, G-A-M-Y. Porogamy. So what is porogamy? It is the entry of pollen tube into the ovule. Porogamy. I will write this word and from where it enters. Entry is through micropyle. Like this you can learn insert. Second one. Generally most of the flowers have this type of entry only. Example, this is the most common mode of pollen tube entry into the ovule. The second one is chalazogamy. The name itself says C-H-A-L-A-Z-O-G-A-M-Y. Chalazogamy. Chalazogamy means if the pollen tube enters from chalaza end, this end, like this is for micropyle, if it enters from this side, that is called chalazogamy, means chalaza end, from this chalaza. And the third one is known as mesogamy. Mesogamy. So what is mesogamy? It is the entry of pollen tube through the synergids, not through the micropyle. You know what is synergids? Synergids means within the embryo sac. You know that ovule has two protective covering. In the earlier class I had said, like ovule is a parenchymatous body. It has two covering around it. Wait, I will draw it here so that you can understand. Okay, what is that? Integuments. This one I have drawn like this, no, ovule, inside which the embryo sac was there, and then I have drawn like this. First integument, do you remember now? And the second integument, this integument. So if pollen tube enters through the integument, like this, the pollen tube enters, that is called mesogamy. Integuments. Okay? Got it now? So there are three modes of entry of pollen tube into the ovule. If it occurs through the micropyle, it is called porogamy. If it occurs through chalaza end, it is called chalazogamy. If it occurs through integuments, which is the covering present around the ovule, it is called mesogamy. Now one point is there to learn or remember. Whatever may be the different modes of entry of pollen tube into the ovule, but ultimately or finally, like if I enter the room from this side or that side, but ultimately where I have to reach? To my destination, means I have to sit to my chair or to my place, bed, isn't it? So ultimately this pollen tube must enter inside the embryo sac through the micropyle only. Means whether they enter through micropyle or through chalaza or through integuments, finally the pollen tube will enter in the embryo sac through the micropyle only. Whether they go from chalaza or integument, no problem. Like coming from chalaza end, but ultimately it will come and enter through the micropyle only. Finally from this only. Although it is coming from here, but entry should be from micropyle only. Understood? Now next is, it can be between. Okay, the next topic which you have to do, discharge of male gametes from the pollen tube. Once the pollen tube has entered inside the ovule, the tip of the pollen tube, like this one, it will burst or open, and it will release both the male gametes into the embryo sac. And after that, I told you, one male gamete fuses with the egg cell. That results in the formation of zygote. The other male gamete fuses with secondary nucleus to form the endosperm. Now next is, what is double fertilization? Already I said, this is the fusion of one male gamete with egg and the other male gamete with the polar nuclei. That's why it is called double fertilization. And why triple fusion? Because the secondary nucleus which is diploid fuses with the haploid male gamete. So 2n plus n, that is called triple fusion. So fusion of male and female gametes is known as fertilization. Okay. Now next we have to study is post-fertilization events. So we can do it in the next class.